I am here tonight to tell you some tales of outrageous parties from an outrageous hostess, New York socialite, Mamie Fish. Mamie Fish was a lot of things. She was brash, strident, rude, barely literate, and she was fun, had a sharp wit, and a keen instinct for entertainment. Her unique parties were legendary, sometimes disruptive, and often very polarizing. Our story starts in the Gilded Age, a time of extraordinary economic boom where a ton of wealth was generated for like 3 people who had all the wealth. So what did these extremely, obscenely wealthy people do? Parties. Raucous, spectacular, diamond-encrusted, no expense spared parties. Also, culturally, with the adoption of the electric light bulb, it meant that well-heeled socialites were partying longer and harder into the evening. So young women would literally dance their finery into rags from the dusk to dawn, champagne-fueled revelry. So Mamie married her husband, Mr. Fish, in 1877, which is right at the beginning of this Gilded Age and right when she would have started hosting society ladies on her own. And at this time, the undisputed leader of society was Mrs. Caroline Astor. And the Astors were once the wealthiest family in America, and there were dozens of influential Astors. But because of her social prominence, she was not a Mrs. Astor, she was the Mrs. Astor. With her right-hand man, her friend, Ward McAllister, they ran the social scene, championing tradition, formality, etiquette, and unrivaled opulence, and a healthy dose of snobbery. However, New York is a melting pot, and with the growth of this period, there arose a tension between those that considered themselves superior by the privilege of their birth and their inheritance, i.e. the knobs, and self-made newcomers with incredible clout and immense fortunes, i.e. the swells. To remain relevant, the Mrs. Astor had to acknowledge that the social fabric was changing and grudgingly include upstart arrivistes like the Vanderbilt family to society, who were, in the Gilded Age, the wealthiest family in the US. But to maintain exclusivity, Ward McAllister created the 400. The idea that there were only 400 people who mattered in New York society. And this grouping included both old and new money and just incredible wealth. And by happenstance, the Mrs. Astor's ballroom happened to hold 400 people. Mamie and her husband, the marvelously mustachioed Stuyvesant Fish, who she lovingly called Stivey, they were naturally in the 400. They came from well-regarded, well-connected, old money American families. Stivey was a railroad executive, and his father was a prominent politician. And they did all right for themselves, even though their fortunes were modest compared to others of the 400. So they held a few residences in New York and other places, and Mamie threw dozens of lavish entertainments in her Manhattan ballroom, and she always decorated with polar bear skins. She preferred, yeah, everyone kind of sucks in this story, it's fine. She preferred champagne to wine because champagne makes guests lively, wine makes them sleepy. Sumptuous galas, balls, luncheons, fundraisers, sometimes with Ward McAllister as a co-planner. However, she became famous for her novelty, and she became known as the fun maker or the showman for her colorful parties. Like the ball where costume dancers led a donkey laden with party favors to be that belonged under a circus tent rather than a gentlewoman's house. Mamie clapped back to the papers. Mrs. Astor is an elderly woman. Oh, that Mamie, always shaking things up. Now, to give you some context for her challenge of convention and the way that she really rankled society, there were a lot of ways that she pushed against these rigid expectations for women. And she was afforded these eccentricities because lots of money. At the time, many women of American families, if they were from respectable families, they were often raised with French as their first language. Society women were expected to be pleasant to listen to, speaking softly and melodiously. Not Mamie. She had no education, and she proudly admitted that she could barely read or write, and she famously had a laugh like a horse. The society adored the opera. Mamie hated the opera. Society adored 4-hour-long, 8-course dinners. Mamie once threw an 8-course dinner in under 50 minutes to keep it lively, where guests were basically fighting waiters to clamp down their plates before they could be whisked away. So she was not refined, but she was very, very fun, which just garnered her immense popularity. And enter a new social darling on the scene. This guy, Henry Lehr, he was the rage in parties, and he frequently helped hostesses and even the Mrs. Astor plan dazzling affairs. They very quickly became friends and collaborators, and just like Mamie, he was a very polarizing figure. For example, I found this description of him in society papers. He is most versatile, playing the piano, dancing the ballet, telling funny stories, pouring afternoon tea, designing his hostess's smartest costume, speaking French with all the foreign fellow guests, are all matters of equal ease. I found this description in another newspaper. He is a coy and roguish pig in men's clothes. While the Mrs. Astor reigned over the Gilded Age, at the turn of the century, new leaders emerged. Known at the time as the triumvirate, these three ladies conducted society affairs of the 400 with opulent gusto. They had the biggest balls of them all. The leadership triumvirate consisted of Tessie Ulrichs, who had Comstock Lode heiress money, Mamie Fish, who we've met, and Alva Belmont, formerly Mrs. Vanderbilt, who had sweet, sweet divorce Vanderbilt railroad money. Just as an aside, Alva Belmont once threw a party that, in today's terms, she would have spent over $7 million on. And $2 million of that budget was for champagne. While Tessie and Alva's fortunes eclipsed Mamie's wealth by probably 100-fold, they were really strict and stringent in following society etiquette. And I think that this is because both Tessie and Alva were nouveau riche, so they had to work harder to show they belonged, to fit in, whereas Mamie Fish was born to society and frankly had no fucks to give. Now, Mamie was considered jockeying for the leadership position in society, but she continued to throw outrageous parties, like this co-plan with Henry Lehr, which was the Newport ball of the season, where she threw the banquet for 100 dogs, where 100 canine guests of honor were invited to a banquet, along with 100 of their human companions. Dogs arrived in tiaras, in little hats, in fancy dress, and many, many diamond collars. One dog had a diamond collar worth, in today's dollars, over $500,000. To create a banquet table fitting for the honored guests, table leaves were set up on short trusses, arranged to be 1 foot high, with scores of butlers serving the guests a sumptuous 3-course meal, while the humans had their own dinner party with human food and lots of human champagne in a separate room. So, speaking of the theme tonight, I can tell you some society gossip about one guest that partied to excess. One dachshund belonging to Governor Elisha Dyer ate so much that he passed out next to his plate and had to be carried home to recover from the extravagance of the banquet. But dogs were not the only notable guests. Mamie entertained plenty of royalty as well. One day, Henry Lehr let it slip to his wife that he had met the mysterious and reclusive Prince del Drago. Yes, of the Roman del Dragos. So his wife told her friends, who told their friends, and soon everyone in the 400 was clamoring to meet the mysterious prince. And so they asked Mamie to throw a reception in his honor. A date was set, and all of the guests arrived to find the unveiling of a tiny monkey in evening clothes. When asked about it, Mamie Fish first denied that this event ever happened. Wink. Henry Lehr wrote that the monkey was perfectly behaved at all times. But some who claimed to have been there insisted that during the evening, drunken dinner guests kept plying the tiny simian with champagne until it got drunk, scaled a chandelier, and threw light bulbs at the guests. Whatever level of this story actually happened, it was a pretty scathing commentary on society's obsession with aristocracy. So people were really, really scandalized that she held American society up to ridicule, and it was sort of, she became universally panned, and like, oh, she's no longer this leader of society. Alva Belmont is the leader of society. So it was written, it is simply appalling to think of Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish becoming the leader of our society. In that case, social life would be a long succession of monkey parties and equally undignified entertainments, which I think sound marvelous. This is just a footnote in her long and glorious tradition of rattling society and pissing people off. She could be very warm, but if she found you boring, she let you know. For example, one guest arrived to one of her parties and she exclaimed, "Oh, how do you do? I had quite forgotten that I asked you." One time she threw a ladies' luncheon for 50 of the women of the 400, and she decided not to attend her own party, and she informed her butler to tell them, "I've changed my mind." She could be very petty, too. So there was another rivalry where this socialite and Duchess Mary Golette was hosting the Grand Duke Boris Vladimirovich of Russia, and it's a very complicated story, but basically Mamie refused to invite one of Mary's house guests. So Mary Golette disinvited herself, all of her guests, and the Grand Duke from going to Mamie's party, but Mamie refused to cancel the party in the honor of the Grand Duke anyway. So when guests arrive, obviously there's no Duke in sight, but Mamie coolly informed all of her guests that she had something better. She had in attendance the Tsar of Russia himself. The doors opened, and there was, oh shit, it's Henry Lehr! Cue the gales of laughter. Incidentally, this charade earned him the new nickname King Lear. And somehow this was considered a social triumph for Mamie, and she kind of wormed her way back into the hearts and popularity of society. However, some rivalries actually had palpable consequences. Like her Vanderbilt rivalry, which I'm going to lovingly call the fuck around and find out rivalry, which this was an incredible scandal and very complicated. But basically, the short version is she snubbed the wrong people amongst the Vanderbilts, and they're railroad people, and they're very close to other railroad people like E. Harriman, who happened to be Mamie Fish's husband's boss, because he was a railroad tycoon. So he, after 20 years, just fired because everyone was sick of Mamie's bullshit. Oops. So even the closest to Mamie were not safe from her derision, including fellow triumvirate leader Alva Belmont. A source once reported that one day Mrs. Belmont swept up to Mamie Fish in a righteous and quite justifiable wrath. "Is it true," she demanded point blank, "that you said at Tessie's last night I reminded you of a frog?" Mrs. Fish drew herself up as if stricken to the heart by such a malicious and unfounded gossip. "No, no," she protested, "not a frog. A toad, my pet, a toad." Tessie Ulrichs was not spared either. In 1913, already the queen of society, she was considered the leader, and she hosted this sumptuous Mother Goose ball where first guests had a luxurious dinner at Tessie Ulrichs and then headed to Mamie's, costumed as fairy tale characters to dance from 10 p.m. until dawn. Mamie presided over the affairs as a fairy godmother. However, she had heard from other guests that somehow Tessie's party preparations had exceeded her own, and Tessie had thrown a better party already. So Mamie sulked and pouted and dabbed her eyes the whole night. And at 2 a.m., she had enough, and she instructed the band to play Home Sweet Home for an hour. And by an hour, even the drunkest party goers got the hint that it was time to leave and go home. And Mamie stopped talking to Tessie, and society panicked, and society papers panicked, and it took some finesse from Henry Lehr, but he managed to get Mamie to repair the rift, and everything was well again, and the lavish parties could continue. However, indeed, the parties could not go on forever. And just 2 short years later, Mamie passed away unexpectedly. And despite of, or perhaps because of her irreverence towards society at the time of her death, she was firmly established as society leader, and her death was front page news and eclipsed other stories of the time. Now, to some, her death signified the end of over-bloated balls held in private homes. Balls. And so many balls. Dozens and dozens. A charitable interpretation is that by challenging and ridiculing the tight laces of society, she helped break down stuffy traditions and pave the way for a freer jazz age of rebellion and individuality. So as I leave you tonight, I want to give you a Mamie Fish welcome to the second half of the show, which is make yourself perfectly at home. And believe me, there is no one who wishes you there more heartily than I do.